Hello everybody and welcome back. Good to talk to all of you again today, and today I've got a sort of know your ship video. So, this is not like the ones I've done before, but it still has some relation to ships historically. And this particular video really sort of started when I was playing World of Warships the other night, and I suddenly had a question. I was like, in the game that we play, we've got high explosive ammo, we've got armor piercing ammo, and there's certain situations where one is used over the other, and if you're one ship type engaging another ship type, you use one or the other. And I was like, is this historically accurate at all, or is it complete arcade mode? Is it like complete fantasy, or is there some degree of realism there? So I decided to go back and look at a number of naval battles to see what kinds of ammunition usage was done in those battles. And I think I have a bit of an answer for all of you. So sit back, relax, and enjoy a couple of relatively interesting stories. First up, let's start with the Battle of the River Plate. And for most of you, this should be a familiar battle. It involved the Admiral Graf Spee engaging 3 British cruisers in the South Atlantic. So the Admiral Graf Spee, her ammunition loadout was 200 rounds of armor piercing, 200 rounds of high explosive nose fuse rounds, and 200 high explosive base fuse rounds. The difference between the two is that the nose fuse, the minute it comes into contact with something, it'll explode. The base fuse rounds will penetrate a little bit before they explode. So you can almost think of sort of HE base fuse rounds as sort of being maybe semi-armor piercing a little bit. Now, the Admiral Graf Spee's ammunition loadout makes a lot of sense. See, she was designed with the idea that she could outrun any ship that could outgun her, and that would be like a capital ship. And if she was engaging a heavily armored capital ship, she would need punchier shell types to at least inflict some damage, right? So the armor-piercing shells make a lot of sense. And at the same time, she was designed to outgun anything that was faster than her. And if she ran into cruisers, her larger caliber high explosive shells will do plenty of damage. Now, during the span of the battle, the Graf Spee actually fired all 200 of her high explosive nose fuse rounds. She fired 184 of her high explosive base fuse rounds, and actually she only fired 30 of her main caliber armor piercing rounds. The high explosive rounds that were used actually did quite a lot of damage. According to the post-action reports on the British side, the high explosive rounds caused unexpected damage and caused a lot of casualties. Most of the fatalities on the bridge, for example, occurred when splinters ricocheted off the underside of the bridge roof, killing a lot of the people on the bridge. The Graf Spee's 150mm secondary guns were also engaged during the fight, primarily firing against the light cruisers. And during the fight, they fired 257 of the high explosive nose fuse rounds and 120 high explosive base fuse rounds. And this makes pretty reasonable sense, considering the 150mm guns were roughly the same size as what was on the British light cruisers. Now, the 3 Allied cruisers, 2 light and 1 heavy, they fired mostly semi-armor piercing shells. And these shells were meant to be used against medium thickness armor. And you'll actually, later on in the video, when I talk about the Japanese engagements, you'll sort of see something very, very similar. This kind of semi-armor piercing shell is very, very effective against cruisers whose armor is not as thick, especially treaty cruisers. Now, as the Graf Spee only had cruiser-level armor, these semi-armor piercing rounds were able to do quite a bit of damage as well. HMS Exeter fired at least 190 rounds of her semi-armor piercing ammunition, most of which was actually fired by the rear Y turret, as her 2 forward turrets, a lot of them got knocked out very early on in the action. One of the hits made by the Exeter penetrated through 2 decks to destroy the raw fuel processing system. This is what left the Graf Spee without sufficient ability to get back to Germany. This is the reason why she was eventually scuttled. Now, the British cruisers, from what I've been able to look up historically, seem to really only have that one type of shell, that semi-armor piercing type of shell. And it does actually make sense. I mean, these shells, they would have near universal application against cruisers and destroyers. They'd have their shells being able to penetrate a bit of the ship before exploding and doing good damage. And against large capital ships, where they're used as support, they would go through the more lightly armored sections and do damage as well. Moving on, let's take a look at another very, very famous battle, that being the Battle of the Denmark Strait. This is the one where HMS Hood and HMS Prince of Wales engaged Bismarck and the Prince Eugen. Now, first let's talk about the two British battleships. HMS Prince of Wales carried exclusively armor-piercing ammunition. She carried 100 rounds of armor-piercing per gun, and it was only much later on, sort of late 1943, where 5 of the armor-piercing rounds swapped out for time-fused high-explosive shells on King George V class battleships. So during this engagement against the Bismarck, the Prince of Wales would fire exclusively armor-piercing ammunition. Of course, the Prince of Wales was the one who landed a bunch of very, very notable hits on the Bismarck. One of these hits was the one that cut off a huge chunk, shall we say, of the Bismarck's fuel supplies. This is what caused her to eventually have to turn around and head back to France. Still, the Prince of Wales wasn't nearly as effective as she could have been. During that battle, she was only able to fire 55 shells out of a possible 160 because she was facing a whole bunch of mechanical issues with her guns, and not only that, the initial approach angle was very poor and the rear gun could not be brought into action. Had all her guns been functioning perfectly and the angle of approach was perfect, the Prince of Wales, I think, could have been a lot more devastating against the Bismarck. For HMS Hood, the numbers aren't as clear-cut. The best numbers I've been able to find so far indicate she carried 80 armor-piercing round per gun, 20 CPC rounds, these being sort of shells that were used against lightly armored targets, as these shells had large bursting charges. One could almost look at that and see sort of that connection to British high-explosive ammunition in World of Warships. Anyways, she would also carry 12 practice and 6 shrapnel rounds, and this is all per gun, on a per gun basis. So if you want to think about the whole ship, multiply it by 8. Against a heavily armored target like the Bismarck, she most likely would have only fired her armor-piercing rounds. Now, Bismarck, during her engagement with the Hood and Prince of Wales, fired 93 of her 353 base-fused armor-piercing shells. Now, these shells did quite significant damage to the Prince of Wales, and of course was responsible for the sinking of HMS Hood. And finally we come upon Prince Eugen. Being a heavy cruiser, Prince Eugen, she would have had a mix of high explosive and armor-piercing ammunition. In 1940, her loadout was supposedly 40 rounds of armor-piercing and 80 rounds of high explosive per gun, and of course 10 star shells. So during her engagement against a heavily armored target like the Hood, she would most likely be using her high explosive shells because her armor piercing most likely wouldn't have done all that much. She is most famous for starting the deck fire on Hood. Alright, so let's switch over to the Pacific Theater, and there's a couple of relatively interesting battles there. The first one we're going to look at is the Second Battle of Guadalcanal. And this one, most of you will know, is the engagement between the USS South Dakota and Washington against the Japanese battleship Kirishima and her escorts. In the actual engagement, South Dakota was the one that was engaged by numerous Japanese warships, and again, the ammunition usage is fairly predictable, with the notable exception of the Kirishima. The Japanese destroyers would fire nose-fused high-explosive shells and were able to score a few hits on the South Dakota. The light cruisers were able to do a bit more internal damage in the superstructure area with their base-fused rounds, as these rounds were able to penetrate a little bit before they started detonating. The two heavy cruisers, Atago and Takao, fired mostly 8-inch Type 91 projectiles. Now, these were designated as armor-piercing rounds, but they were in reality more similar to the British semi-armor piercing rounds. They were particularly designed to defeat the armor designs of pre-war US cruisers. Now, as these escorting ships were anticipating a possible engagement against lighter US ships, they were preparing shells to deal with that kind of enemy target. So when they finally did stumble upon the US South Dakota, their shell usage is to be expected. Of the two heavy cruisers, they fired a total of 91 of their armor-piercing shells. Again, remember, they are kind of like semi-armor-piercing shells. Out of the two cruisers, Otago did manage to fire some 8-inch Type 0 nose-fuse high-explosive rounds, but the number is really low at only 6 rounds. But I did mention that Kirishima is a bit of an interesting case, as she was a bit of an exception, and there's a good reason why. In this particular engagement, she did not expect to have to fight US battleships. Her main role was actually to bombard Henderson Field. So in her shell hoists, in her easy-to-access shell sort of storage area, she had loaded for bombardment duties, which consisted mostly of incendiary and high-explosive ammunition. So all of a sudden, out comes a capital ship. So she immediately would have to fire something. So she would fire the things that were ready, but it would take a good number of minutes before she was able to switch over to armor-piercing shells. And if you look at the number of shells she fires, it makes a lot of sense. So against the South Dakota and the Washington, because that again was a complete surprise to the Kirishima, she fired 66 of her 14-inch Type 3 incendiary rounds. Now, these were meant to spray shrapnel and, debris into an airfield to basically wreck airplanes and kill as much people as possible. She also fired 22 rounds of 14-inch Type 0 nose-fuse high-explosive rounds. Again, this was designed for bombardment duties. Now, eventually, she would be able to change over to her 14-inch Type 1 armor-piercing shells, but she would only fire just 27 of them during the entire engagement. In total, she would land 6 hits with her main guns on the South Dakota, 2 hits with incendiary, 2 hits with high explosive, and 2 with her armor piercing, although damage was, really minimal. In return, however, the American battleships were ready for a fight, and they had loaded the correct type of ammunition, and they savaged the Japanese battleship. So the USS Washington, because that's the one we're going to be talking about, as the South Dakota was dealing with major technical problems and did not get to fire off her main guns, the Washington's engagement against the Kirishima was brutally short. I mean, if you look at the engagement times, in the first 2 minutes and 39 seconds, she fired 39 of her 16-inch armor-piercing shells. Then there was a brief pause of about 1 minute and 30 seconds because there was a report that the ship had been sunk, which was not true. And of course, the second that was realized, firing resumed for another 2 minutes and 45 seconds, and 36 more 16-inch armor-piercing shells were fired. In total, 75 armor-piercing shells were fired. 20 hits with large caliber guns were recorded, and the Kirishima was just utterly devastated. Washington's 5-inch secondary guns also fired off high explosive shells, numbering about 107 in total for a total number of 17 hits. Now for the 5-inch guns, it was a bit of a mid-range engagement, so the shells still had to travel in a bit of an arc, and it was a little bit harder to hit. For the 16-inch guns, the engagement distance was essentially a flat trajectory, and that just allowed the gunners to walk the shell fire from one end of the battleship to the other, absolutely devastating the battleship. Now, in terms of ammunition type for the US 5-inch 38, it's actually quite interesting. So supposedly how the shells worked is, it was sort of one standard shell, and depending on which kind of fuse you put into it, it would do different roles. So if you put a nose fuse round in there, it would become a high explosive shell. If you put in like a time fuse or whatnot, it could become an anti-aircraft shell. So pretty interesting. And again, if you look at the ammunition usage, it's not exactly completely, off the deep end, right, compared to the game. It's actually not that bad. Now, I mentioned the two heavy cruisers engaging the South Dakota, and their 8-inch semi-armor piercing, they called it an armor piercing round, but it was really a semi-armor piercing round. it was able to do sort of superficial damage, but it didn't seem very devastating. But those shells, when used against the right targets, were absolutely lethal. Which moves us to the final battle that we're going to be looking at today, which is the Battle of Savo Island. During the Battle of Savo Island, a Japanese task force comprising the heavy cruisers Chokai, Aoba, Kinugasa, Furutaka, and Kako, along with the light cruisers Tenryu and Yubari, encountered an allied task force comprised 5 heavy cruisers, HMAS Canberra, USS Chicago, Vincennes, Quincy, and Astoria, and some supporting destroyers. Now, the Japanese task force first encountered HMAS Canberra and USS Chicago. Since Canberra was the lead ship, she took the brunt of the fire, and here is where you see that proper ammo type usage against the proper kind of ship. It was devastating. Canberra wasn't even able to get off a shot. She took 24 8-inch hits within just a few minutes and was completely disabled. Chicago took a torpedo and was able to sort of limp away, so we're not really going to spend too much time with her. The next engagement happened when the Japanese task force came upon the 3 other US heavy cruisers. And once again, the shell fire from their 8-inch armor piercing and the 5.5-inch high explosive from the 2 light cruisers, they were able to just devastate these heavy cruisers. I mean, if you look at the number of hits, Astoria took at least 65 combined hits. Quincy took 36 hits and 2 torpedoes. Vincennes took 57 hits and 1 torpedo. The most significant damage was done by the Japanese 8-inch armor-piercing shells, as they were able to knock out propulsion, knock out turrets on the US cruisers. In the battle, 6 out of the 9 8-inch gun turrets on the US heavy cruisers were knocked out by direct hits from these 8-inch shells. Plus, at a range of less than 5,000 yards, hits were achieved very, very rapidly and with a high degree of accuracy. While the Quincy and the Vincennes had damage so extensive that the ships were absolutely 100% going to sink, the Astoria could have actually been saved. However, fires on that ship, well, they were quite lethal. In that particular case, the fires, they exploded the ammunition in the 5-inch hoists, and then the heat from those fires eventually reached and exploded the 5-inch magazine, and that blew a hole in the side of the ship and caused her to sink within 45 minutes. In this particular battle, the right ammo used against the targets that they were designed to be used against led to lethal results. Now, on a side note, and this is a really cool little side note, during the first naval battle of Guadalcanal, 14-inch incendiary ammo, so this is the type that the Japanese battleships were using for bombardment, were fired by Japanese battleships at the USS San Francisco. But those shells did minimal damage. Had she been hit by 14-inch armor piercing, the story could have been very, very different. But once again, in that particular engagement, the battleships were preparing to do a bombardment mission. So they had all the bombardment shells loaded, and it took them a good couple of minutes to switch over to the anti-ship armor piercing rounds. So, all in all, the ammo type usage in World of Warships, well, not perfect, is surprisingly close at times to real life. I mean, sure, in real life, there was a little bit more sort of variety in shell types. There was not so much armor piercing for cruisers. It was more like semi-armor piercing. But again, in terms of sort of overall usage, it's relatively close, right? If you look at sort of destroyer caliber guns on battleships, which were the secondary guns, or on destroyers, when they engaged targets, it mostly consisted of high explosive ammunition. When you looked at cruiser engagements, if they were dealing with something very, very heavily armored, they would be firing more high explosive. If they were dealing with something that they were designed to engage, so other cruisers, for example, they would use their armor piercing / semi armor piercing to great effect. And for battleship and battleship engagements, armor piercing is the dominant ammunition type. Although, depending on the mission, right, in the event of the Kirishima, for example, she was loaded for shore bombardment, so when the battleship popped out, she just had to fire what she had. And the damage, of course, was relatively negligible in comparison to how she just started off firing armor-piercing salvos. Anyways, I hope you found this video interesting. It was just one of those interesting questions that popped in my mind while I was playing the game, and I was like, I gotta find out about this, and decided to look it up. Of course, if you've got any comments, questions, other stories, post them in the comment section below. I would love to read them. Anyways, folks, hope you all enjoy this video. Take care, have yourselves a good one, and I will talk to all of you again really, really soon.